Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on LGBTQ immigrants becoming visible. I would like to hand it off to our own research director, Dr. Kerith Conron, for our moderator today.
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to LGBT Immigrants Becoming Visible. I want to start by acknowledging that we are broadcasting live from UCLA, where we acknowledge our presence on the traditional lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people, reminded that we are a country of immigrants. Our focus today is on LGBT immigrants, of which there are nearly 1.3 million living in the United States, including over 300,000 who live in California. So thanks for joining us today to learn about the contributions, experiences, and needs of California's LGBT immigrants. With me to discuss key areas of immigration policy, as well as opportunities to improve the service landscape for LGBT immigrants, are our panelists. Bamby Salcedo, founder and CEO of the TransLatin Coalition, Jorge Diaz, program manager at Equality California, and Tess Feldman, staff attorney and immigration law project manager at the LA LGBT Center. Today, we're going to do two things. We're going to go through some quick facts and figures about LGBT immigrants from our Lives of LGBTQ Immigrants in California project, focusing on non-citizens who do not have green cards, our most vulnerable residents. And then this will be followed by a panel discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we'll end with Q&A from the audience. So with that, Kim, can you cue the slides, please? Okay, great, thank you. We'd like to acknowledge our funding support from Arcus Foundation. Thank you, next slide. All right, and of course, we couldn't do any of our work without our research team members, our community advisory board members. Next. Thank you. And of course, without data. So we were very grateful to the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research for collecting information, not only about sexual orientation for over 20 years, but since 2015 about gender identity, and then also for quite some time, information about citizenship status. This is very rare to have all these bits of information collected on one survey, particularly a really large representative survey. So it's quite a treasure to be able to analyze these data, which we did for the project. So in terms of the California Health Interview Survey, which we affectionately call CHIS, it is a survey of more than 20,000 households sampled each year who complete a survey on a range of health topics. The survey is done not only in English, but Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, Vietnamese, and I'm going to screw that up. All right, we're just going to go past it. For this project, we looked at pooled data between 2015 and 2021. We were able to use sample weights provided by the CHIS folks to make sure the data represented adults ages 18 and up living in California households. Next. Altogether, using a tool from AskChis, we estimate that there are 370,000 LGBT immigrants who live across California, with particular concentrations in Southern California. Next. Thank you. So when we pull the data from 2015 to 2021, looking at information from over 153,000 people who completed surveys, we found that nearly 4% of people were LGBT among folks who were not US-born citizens. We found that more than 18% of the LGBT sample were immigrants. And when we drill down in particular, we're looking at the 4.1% of the LGBT sample who were non-citizens without green cards. And we're going to focus in on this particular population for the next few slides. Next. Thanks. So if we look at our LGBT non-citizens who don't hold green cards, their age distribution looks like this. These are all percentages. About 3/4 of the sample of folks in this group are between the ages of 25 and 49. Next. About 7% of LGBT immigrants without green cards are transgender. Next. In terms of sexual orientation, we see that about half of this group are bisexually identified. Next. In terms of relationships, more than 1/3 of people are married or living with partners. Next. 20% have kids in the household. Next. In terms of region of birth, we see that more than half of folks have ties to Mexico, and that most of this group is from Mexico, Central America, or another Latin American country. Next. In terms of race ethnicity, 84% of non-citizens without green cards who are LGBT in California are Latinx. Next slide. There's a diversity of languages spoken at home, but as you'd expect, Spanish and English and Spanish are the two most common combinations for this group. Next. 41% of this group reported that they do not speak English well or at all. Next. In terms of educational attainment, almost 2/3 of LGBT non-citizens without green cards have a high school education or less. Next. But many are working, 92% in fact are in the workforce, and most people are working full-time or part-time. Next. 1/3 are working more than 40 hours a week, more than 1/4 work in service occupations, and 1/5 are self-employed. Next. Many people are living in poverty. In fact, 58% are living at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, which is less than $34,000 a year for a family of 2. If you live in the state of California, you know that living at less than $34,000 a year is quite a feat, particularly with the cost of housing. Next. Among people earning less than $34,000 a year for a family or 2, or at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, 1/5 report experiencing food insecurity with hunger. Next. In terms of region of residence, about 2/3 of our non-citizens without green cards are living in LA or Southern California, which is why it's so fabulous to have TLC and the LA LGBT Center with us. Next. 78% of this group rents housing, and that means with high levels of poverty and high rents in this area, they are vulnerable to housing insecurity. Next. Many people lack health insurance, about 42%. And not surprisingly, next, a similar proportion reports that they have no usual source of health care. Next. More than 1/4 report fair or poor health, and 15% met criteria for psychiatric distress. Next. And those are the end of the formal slides. But we wanted to provide a little bit of context about our most vulnerable group of LGBT immigrants from a population-based representative sample. And now we want to hear about the immigrants who are served by TLC, the LA Center, to hear about the great work that Equality California is doing, advocating for LGBT immigrants and everybody else in the state. So at this moment, I'm going to turn to Bamby Salcedo. Bamby, you are the founder of TransLatin Coalition. What motivated you to start TLC?
Bueno, primero que nada, buenas tardes, buenos días. Quiero dar gracias a mi poder superior por darme la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes. Quiero honrar su presencia y la tierra en la cual estamos aquí hoy en día. Thank you, Kerith, for your question. You know, I think it's important to highlight that when we started as an organization, we started as a volunteer-driven organization, really thinking about how we were going to address the specific needs and issues that trans migrants were experiencing while in immigration detention. And so we started doing fundraising to put money in their books. We would visit them, we would write letters to them, and we would also pick them up and could link them to supportive services. And we were doing that for about 6 years until we were seeing that across the United States, our community were not having necessarily access to basic services that they needed. And so our national group decided that we also needed to move into doing service provision. And that's how we started the Center for Violence Prevention and Prevention, the one that's here in Los Angeles. And we got our official grant in January 2016. And since then, we have built here in Los Angeles a multi-purpose, multi-million space that's specifically dedicated to uplift members of the transgender, non-conforming, intersex community, obviously with an emphasis and focus on supporting trans migrants. And so, yeah, so that's, that's how we started. And obviously, like many other organizations, we started because of the need.
Thank you. I have a follow-up. What do the people who are served by TLC, particularly those who are immigrants, need to live well? What services are needed? What policy changes are needed? What should we be doing? What do people need?
Well, I mean, I think we have to sort of like first, in my opinion, look at the macro level work, right? Like, I think really think about how the immigration system is set up, right? That don't necessarily support trans women, right? Like, as a community, we already have multiple challenges, right? Just for being who we are. But when trans women like myself who flee their countries to try to save their lives, and then they're caged, right, for trying to save their lives. And then while they're incarcerated, they experience horrific experiences in incarceration. And because of the advocacy efforts that we have done over the years, it is true that more trans people are getting out from immigration detention quicker. But trans women specifically, right, like they have cases pending and court hearings pending that up to like 2 to 3 years in some cases, and they come out to really nothing, right? Like a lot of times they don't have documents like that would identify them. They don't have a way to even be employed. Obviously, there's this acculturation process that also happens. And then coupled with, the language barriers and like many challenges, right, that many immigrants experience. But the way the system is set up essentially like pushes for trans women to continue to engage in the straight economy in order to survive. And that is part of sort of like the recidivism process that happens that, gets trans women to be arrested and then ultimately end up in immigration detention and perhaps being sent back to their countries. And we know of cases to where trans women who have been sent back to their countries have been killed. And so, I think we need to start there, but obviously, we need to also provide the basic services, right, that people need, like food and shelter. And I mean, some of the things that we're able to do for some members of our community is to like even, purchase chones, right, or or underwear, right? Because it's like literally people when they come out from immigration detention, they have really nothing. And so we have to obviously just think of how multidimensional this work needs to happen, right? And really ensure that we support those who are the most impacted by our immigration system.
Thank you, Bamby. In the news, the mayor of New York, the governor of Massachusetts, President Biden have all been talking a lot for reforms that are needed to increase access to work authorization documents. It would be great to hear somebody on the panel kind of talk about what's in the way of people obtaining work when they migrate to this country. What are the steps and how can we sort of accelerate that process?
Yes.
Jorge-Armando, I don't know if you want to answer this one, but I'm happy to as an immigration attorney. And I think Bamby could also answer this one. Those of us who are in direct services in the field see this question a lot, and access to employment authorization is one of the biggest challenges that I think all immigrants face in their, journey of going through an immigration process here in the United States. It's most certainly intentionally designed to be difficult. The employment authorization document process is not designed as a welcoming process to help people get to stability quickly and safely. The rules could be changed to make those applications easy and quickly get them into people's hands, especially the people who are most vulnerable and at high risk. So I am really grateful that much of the national dialogue around asylum seekers, around arriving aliens and people who are coming from the border, it's great to hear that there's a little bit of sort of pop culture awareness about the right to work and the right to get employment authorization documents. As it relates to LGBTQIA plus people, it's the first question I see when I meet a new client. How can I get safe identification that affirms who I am, the name that I use that keeps me safe, and the gender that I use that reflects who I am? And it's one of the harder questions I hear myself answering sometimes 10 times a day. The population that I serve are primarily people pursuing humanitarian immigration relief, most frequently in the form of asylum, although we file a lot of applications for youth, trafficking survivors of crimes that happen here in the United States. But generalizing my answer to reflect the journey of asylum seekers, these are people who have followed the rules, they've followed procedure, they are working within the system properly, they haven't committed a civil immigration violation or a crime, and at best, they have a 150-day wait before they can apply for employment authorization. And we're seeing the delay of at least a year to get employment authorization documents in people's hands. The challenge is that here in LA County, for example, and Bamby, I know you see this in our backyard, one needs ID or a social security number to apply for a legal name and gender marker change in the county. And so it's this very, very dangerous, vicious cycle of you can't work, you can't get a social security number, you can't get those documents to reflect the name that keeps you safe, that you use and prefer and reflects who you are, until you have legal, valid federal ID, and back and forth it goes. And I'm speaking generally. It can be done in some cases, and some people have good success, but what we see for our homeless youth and seniors that we serve, and all of the clients that come to my office through TLC and Bamby's community, we see a really heightened risk and lots more discrimination, lots more challenges of access to healthcare, education, banking, without ID that reflects someone's true identity. It's really, really challenging. I am very buoyed by this week's recent announcement that asylum seeker employment authorization documents should be issued in 5-year increments sometime in the future. That will be a game changer for the populations that we serve.
Thank you, Tess. Jorge, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a clinician by training, but I think that the system, I think that they put Latinos, immigrants in this one big box, and the system is supposed to work for all of us, equally. And I think that's just not the case. I think Bamby did a great job to highlight the struggles that trans women face, right? This idea that us as Americans think that people come here just to work is just not true, right? People don't just come to America to work and search for a better life. Trans women come here to save their lives, right? They're not necessarily here to work. They're here because they can be murdered in their countries, right? So this idea that trans women have all of these obstacles once they get here for being who they are is really sad, right? It's really sad that they come with such traumas trying to survive and save their lives, and then they get here and we wonder why we push them to sex work, right? We wonder why they end up with substance use. There's a level of trauma that I think that comes with migrating to this country that I think Americans have forgotten about, that we just come here to work. We bring so much trauma migrating to this country, and trans women bring probably double the amount of trauma, right? And a lot of trans women, when I would see them in therapy, they come here to nothing. You know, there is no family member here waiting to give them a home. You know, there is no friends, right? So can you just imagine being a trans woman from El Salvador, Mexico, and being incarcerated once you get here for 90 days and then being released and be expected to be successful? And it's really sad that the system is not tweaked or to serve trans women and LGBTQ plus people and all of the layers of issues that we come with when we arrive to America.
Bamby, would you like to follow up on that? I know you recently did a needs assessment project with the city. Wondering if there are any findings you want to share or just general sort of thoughts and reactions to Jorge's comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Kerith. And you know, we're really grateful and an honor that we had the opportunity to work with the Williams Institute to do this quality of life needs assessment. And yes, there were, you know, it was open for the general transgender conforming intersex community, but there were obviously some individuals who were migrants in this research study. But I think I want to speak to the broader issue, you know, because I think, you know, it has been said, right, that that the most complicated laws, right, are with the IRS and the immigration system, right? Like it's really complicated. And really, a lot of people think that just because we have government precedent and, you know, yeah, like a Democratic Party, you know, leadership, I guess, that, you know, the immigration issues of our community are going to get better, right? And we have to understand that, you know, Obama ran with the promise that there was going to be an like an immigration reform, right? And that never happened. And you know, this administration also, you know, continues to put policies that criminalize people, right? I mean, just the, you know, what happened with Title 42, for instance, right? Really, again, for trans people and like many people who are fleeing their countries because of the violence that they experience, right? And wait at the borders, be targets of violence, right? And it essentially people being killed and raped and kidnapped, and those are real things that people experience, right? And so when, you know, this administration, you know, makes a decision to, you know, to enact a policy that impacts people's lives, right, in a serious way, it's not, they don't stand for what they say that they do. And so I think it's important for us to like not to be sidetracked with messages that, you know, we hear that we want to hear, but rather to, you know, hold these individuals accountable, right, for you know, for them to understand that they're ultimately, you know, elected officials and they do need to do the work of the people. And that includes, you know, at all levels, right? Like federally, statewide, and, you know, local governments. And so, you know, I think the immigration issues, it's super complicated, but we need to be involved. And that's why we here in Los Angeles have a coalition that is it's called Immigrants RLA, which is a coalition of about 100 organizations that provide services for immigrant people here in Los Angeles. And, and one of the ways that we can ensure that immigrant communities receive the services and support that they need is to really ensure that we participate through the budget process and that we make sure that there's resource allocation specifically for our community. Because here in Los Angeles, for instance, over a third of the population are immigrants, right? And that includes LGBTQ plus immigrants and certainly, transgender and conforming intersex individuals. So I think we really need to think about like the broader picture and how we're going to really transform the system as is.
Thank you, Bamby. When I think about LGBT people and LGBT immigrants, I think about, two different kinds of issues and policies. One are sort of about broader problems with the immigration system, right? And broad reforms that are needed. And then I also think about, is there anything specific related to LGBT people that we need to think about as far as policy reform, like conditions related to seeking asylum and refugee status? So, Tess, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about any specific barriers or gaps in current immigration laws that disproportionately impact LGBT people and families. And then sort of my broader question for the group is sort of like, what are the broader immigration reforms that we should be seeking and asking for, rather than accepting sort of the platitudes or the broad statements of support from politicians whose actions are actually inconsistent with those broad statements of support. So I think the more that folks in this audience can understand the specific problems and the specific leverage opportunities and the asks, I think we'll have expanding the coalition of people of concern who can think about advocating for policy change. Is, I think, one of the goals for this panel and probably for many of our audience members. So, Tess, if you can remember the original question, take it away. Otherwise, I'm happy to restate.
No, I'm happy to address some of what you brought up in all of those big ideas, Kerith. And I also want to give a little asterisk to some of my comments that while Bamby and Jorge and I see, people every day that we've talked about that are facing these, immense multi-factor marginalizations and active hostilities preventing them from succeeding and safely being who they are. I also just want to take a second to name that some of my clients are, wildly successful, incredibly brilliant, safe, stable, healthy, happy people who, even facing all of this intersectional harm, high risk factors in their life, they're succeeding and doing incredibly well on their own, without the help of me as a white primary English language speaking attorney helping them along the way. So naming that, I just want to, I'll pivot to getting to your question about policy, Kerith, that some of what I see day to day in direct service is actually not immigration policy at present, but because the networks of LGBTQ people are tight and vibrant and communication can be really strong through them, and chosen family networks have become such safe spaces for them. Sometimes the rumor mill and the legacy of harmful policies has lived longer than those harmful policies. So Jorge-Armando, you might see this in your practice. I often get people who come to me and say, well, I want to do this for my immigration case, but isn't it still the case that an HIV status precludes me from passing this part of a medical exam? Or is that, I've heard that it was a ground of inadmissibility. And they're correct. Fortunately, that policy has since changed. But for many, many years, I think the legacy damage is still being done from anti-LGBT policies in the immigration space, such as HIV positivity or HIV status being a negative factor on a medical exam that would render someone completely ineligible from access to a green card. Similarly, the celebration of right to marriage in this country is still relatively young. And so an entire branch of immigration law based on family status, where a husband could apply for the person they're married to, or the children of someone marries gets the benefit of an access to a green card. The anti-LGBT family history in this country until quite recently has disproportionately impacted LGBTQ immigrant families, no question. And so I think people sometimes think there are barriers there that have since been removed, but the harm is still ongoing. And while I couldn't agree more with Bamby that we are in an anti-immigrant political administration, though perhaps not as overtly hostile as the last one, there are still bright spots that I am grateful for every day when clients can take advantage of them. So the June 2015 trans detention memo is something that all practitioners should be aware of, that oversees guidelines about trans people in ICE custody. We absolutely should not put LGBTQIA+ people in ICE detention. No one should be in ICE detention, right? Children should not be, families should not be, people with healthcare needs should not be. But above all, LGBTQIA people are at increased risk of danger just from being there. And so, advocates should reference that memo. It's back in place now that we have the Biden administration at the helm. And finally, a change that's coming is the ability to apply for immigration benefits without having to be forced to check the binary gender marker of male or female on every single form that one fills out. USCIS has announced that there will be a non-gender conforming option, like an X, the same way the State Department has authorized for passports here in this country. So long overdue, certainly not perfect, but definitely going to make, we'll see how many million of people feel more safe and comfortable applying for benefits that they're legally entitled to, which until now they have been excluded from feeling safe in making that application. So I hope that addresses some of your question, Kerith, about policies that we've seen in the past and where we are now. Something that I speak about a lot that I'm very passionate about is how unsafe government and immigration spaces are for LGBTQI people of all kinds, high risk or low risk, other factors. I was able to speak with immigration judges and their staff, some of whom never realized the restrooms in all of their spaces are a forced binary that excludes people. The way that they can change people's names in court documents. People, adjudicators don't feel comfortable that they have the authority to use a safe name for somebody who maybe is trans or gender nonconforming. So I think advocates should feel very empowered to keep pushing to ask for policies that include the clients that they serve or the people that they work with, because it's essential that we frame it as a matter of safety. This isn't politics. This isn't opinion. This isn't about individuals. This is about safety.
Thank you, Tess. Jorge, talk to us about Equality California. California has, worked to expand Medi-Cal coverage to some, groups of people, immigrants in the state of California, even those who may not have green cards. What legislative or other actions would Equality California like to see to improve the lives of LGBT immigrants in the state?
I was just going to say, what would I like to see?
What would you like to see?
I think that we've come to a point of accepting what we have in place, and there's the immigration system is broken and it is not fair, and it's not fair for LGBTQ people, especially trans people. We've come to a point where we've accepted that when someone who's of trans experience comes to America, we've accepted this idea that it's okay to incarcerate them. right? You can call ICE, whatever you want to call it, but the reality is that we as a society in America have accepted this idea that it's okay for us to put a trans woman in jail for 90 days, 120 days, who's coming here to fleeing, her life, right? For her life. So this idea that this ICE system is okay we need to relook at that, right? Because it is not okay to put children and women and trans women in detention centers. And for some reason, we've come to a point where we're like, well, that is the process, that is the system, and we should be okay with that. And that is not okay. There is no threat to society from trans women fleeing Mexico or El Salvador. And so this idea that we've accepted that as part of our immigration process is really sad. And we need to relook at that and revamp that, because that should not be okay. We should not be okay having our people incarcerated for more than 2 hours, let alone 90 days. I think we as Americans, we just somehow have forgotten that it's not this beautiful journey that people take leaving their country of origin to get to the borders of Texas and Arizona. It is a traumatic experience, especially for trans women. So to answer your question, Equality California has done and does a lot for policy change. And, we do a lot of great work. But to answer the question, I would like for us to look at this ICE detention part of the process, because I think that as a society, we've just learned to accept it as part of the process, and it's okay, right? They're being sheltered, they have food, but it is not okay. And I think every trans woman that has come to seek mental health from me has never said, I had a great time at the ICE detention center. They were re-traumatized. So to answer your question, I think we have to create policies that protect people once they're here, because putting them in buses and shipping them from one state to another is not okay. And certainly incarcerating them in ICE detention is also not okay, because they're refugees, they're not criminals.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple, themes that kind of emerge from your remarks, Jorge, and they include what is the world we would like to see? What should we work towards as far as the resources and supports that are here for people when they arrive? On sort of like the service side, and the flip side of this is, how do we extend at least temporary authorized status to more people crossing the border? If it's temporary protected, the TPS program, if there need to be special conditions for LGBT people crossing the border, if there needs to be, at one point ICE approached folks in the Massachusetts area about building an LGBT specific ICE detention center. And several of us said, we can't imagine that that's a good thing either. And, with a certain amount of distrust about ICE. But I'm wondering if that idea has been proposed, the way that there is a quote unquote gay jail, in the county system. What are some of your thoughts, whether they're on this, like sort of the service side around the receiving environment, and what should be here in place, even in LA County, for new arrivals? And what should we thinking about from sort of the law and policy side about ways to improve access to it, even just at minimum temporary authorized status in the country? So it leaves that bundle of questions sort of open to the group.
So can I start, if you don't mind? I think, like, honestly, we have to understand again, right? Like the macro level issue, right? As to why is it that people are fleeing their countries, right? Just in general, we know that, for trans women specifically, right? We flee our countries because of the violence that we experience in our countries. but in general, you know, the US has invaded many countries, and you know, and they are essentially the ones who contribute to the violence that many people experience, right? Which includes poverty, which includes you know, guns and, you know, drugs and all kinds of stuff, right? And so that is an issue. Like, I think the US needs to stop getting into other countries, you know. So that's sort of like one of the main things that need to happen. And but I think also, you know, I think we should also eliminate all forms of immigration detention, right? You know, they tried, they had a pot, right? Like, trans women were experiencing extreme violence in immigration detention, right? And so, you know, their band-aid to the issue was to create a transgender pod that started here in Santana, California, right? And then, you know, with even then the violence that trans women experience, right, from these private entities that ICE contract with, right, that they're not trained to even, you know, be sensitive to people in general, right? And so, you know, people were moved to different places, to Cibola, and then to like Washington, and, you know, and Colorado. And so we know that that doesn't work, right? I think there's a systemic change that needs to happen, right? So one, we need to stop gauging people for trying to save their lives, and really, you know, think, how is it that instead of investing those billions of dollars in other countries, right, why don't invest a portion of that to the people who are coming to this country and provide the needed services that people need, right? And so I think if we can start with that, that will be a big step.
Thank you. I know that there are free legal services for new arrivals. Jorge, following up on your points about trauma, reflected also in levels of psychiatric distress that we see in the population-based data. Are there free mental health services for new immigrants, people who are part of the LGBT community who've been exposed to trauma and violence, if it's through the migration process in their countries of origin, along the way, here upon arrival? Are there such resources? If they're not, how could they be created?
Well, it's kind of, I kind of would just, Bamby just mentioned, I think, so to answer your question, there are programs, there are mental health programs out there that do amazing work. There are a lot of orgs who do amazing work. The problem is that mental health itself is a complicated, you know, conversation among Latino people anyway, right? And so I think that this idea that people who get here and who make it through the ICE detention system, that they're gonna just sign up for mental health, you know, to receive mental health. You know, can you imagine you're released from this ICE detention center where you've been there for 160 days? The last thing you want to do is be visible. You just want to survive, and you don't want no one to know where you live. You don't want anyone to know anything about you, your address. And so it's really sad that, yes, there are services out there, but the trauma that folks come to America with, and then the trauma that the immigration system inflicts upon them, and then this idea that they're going to line up to receive services. I think mental health is amazing, and I think we need more of it, and that is a basic need, but there are other basic needs that we need to work on, such as housing and food, before mental health, right? there are programs out there, but I think that the unfortunate thing is what we're asking of people when they seek those mental health services, right? They have survived leaving their country of origin. They have survived the United States immigration system. And now we are expected them to just open up to me as a clinician and just, open up all those traumas and then go back to nothing, and so it's really sad, it's really sad. I think we need to look at how much money we are spending in the ICE detention system, from staffing to everything that goes in to an ICE, and put that into resources and services, right? How much money is put in nationwide to ICE detention system, and what can you do with that money for folks who are arriving to the United States, right? Mental health is amazing. I'm a mental health clinician by training. I believe in mental health, but I also believe it's a lot to ask of folks once they are being released from these detention centers. Folks just want to eat. They want a safe space to sleep, and so I think we need to focus on those needs before pushing them into mental health. Unfortunately, my last comment on this topic, unfortunately for folks, especially trans women who are seeking asylum, there's this thing that they have to go seek mental health, to almost prove their asylum case. I think it's really sad that sometimes they need to go through mental health to almost like prove that they were a victim of trauma or some type of life-threatening experience in their country of origin. I think mental health should be a choice. And I think that for someone arriving to this country, it's probably not the number one thing on their list.
Thank you, Jorge. We have a comment from one of the audience members who suggests, because I'm hearing from both you and Bamby, we need to prioritize resource reallocation. There are major kind of systemic changes that need to happen. There are country level policies that need to happen with regard to our involvement in other countries. Political situations, or just general, colonialization legacies, but around the topic of resource allocation, which I think is a great point, an idea that many people can advocate for and get behind. One of our guests suggested joining forces with the American Immigration Lawyers Association or the American Immigration Council. And so making sure that there's a coalition of people who are advocating for some of the same kinds of changes that would benefit LGBTQ immigrants. Tess, I see you smiling.
Yeah, for the names of attendees who I recognize that may have joined us through words that I was able to share through the American Immigration Lawyers Network, please reach out to me. We are organizing to meet buses that are showing up on random days here in California. We need practitioners to be competent and trained in how to help these most vulnerable folk, even if maybe their area of practice isn't humanitarian relief. They can learn, and we should learn lessons from the last time we found ourselves in an anti-immigrant hostile political regime. We can get started before some of those changes occur, and those conversations are happening nationally with partners like those who are named in the chat. So please don't hesitate to connect with me if anyone's interested in having those conversations from an attorney perspective with immigration attorney groups.
Thank you, Tess. One of our attendees asks about the main issues that LGBT refugees face in their countries of origin. And Jorge and Bamby, you've talked a lot about violence against trans women. Any other experiences that people are having in their countries of origin, and also when they arrive in resettlement areas that people should be thinking about and aware of? Like, I'm wondering about access to jobs. Like, is employment discrimination an issue, or family acceptance and rejection, or intimate partner violence, or some of the things that we see in the United States for LGBTQ people? Are these similar issues that folks are experiencing in their countries of origin?
Yes, for what we have heard and what we have learned from people who, who come here from different parts of the Latin America for the most part, is well, for trans women, right? Like even in our countries, right? It's really like the discrimination is really extreme, right? I think it's important to recognize that particularly Latin American countries are primarily dominated by Catholic religion, right? And so that is sort of like ingrained in most people. And so that influenced the way people think about trans women specifically. And so in Latin American countries, for the most part, people don't have, trans women specifically don't have the ability to have employment, to even have access to healthcare. I mean, the healthcare system in those countries it's like crazy, so, if the general public don't have access to good health care, right? Obviously, trans people, gender nonconforming people, intersex people, and, particularly trans women, are not paid attention to. And so all of those things, right? Like, I mean, just violence and all of its forms, right? Like interpersonal violence are some of the things that, trans women experience. And all of those reasons is, push people to flee their country, but it's coupled with the actual threat to their lives, right? That happens, that really pushes for them to find a way to save their lives and to come to this country, to seek the American dream, only getting to this country to find the American nightmare.
If I can just follow up on that, just would stick to one issue, and that is the HIV issue, which goes along with medical care. I think that we have this idea that we have our hands on HIV and we're beating and we're winning the fight. I don't know if that's true here, even in America, right? But I think the statistics don't lie on the HIV infection rate among Latino gay men or men who have sex with other men. And so there are a lot of folks, and I don't want to put the narrative out there that people who are HIV positive from other countries come here to seek free medical care. By no means am I saying that. But what I am saying is that there are people who live in Mexico and El Salvador who do not live in large cities where there is no HIV medical care, right? So the access to actual HIV medical treatment in some of these countries is poor. And then the shame and stigma associated with being HIV positive in those countries is just beyond, I mean, we see it here in America when, we have made so many strides in the HIV fight, but in Latino households and many, HIV is still a very shameful, stigmatized, medical condition. I can't imagine what it's like in El Salvador or in Mexico. If you don't live in Guadalajara or Mexico City, and you live in some like rancho somewhere, and you're HIV positive and you're trans or you're gay, the access to HIV treatment, and then the shame and stigma surrounding who you are as an HIV positive person. They do not come to America to seek HIV-free medical care by no means, but poor HIV treatment and care in those countries may be a factor for why they come here, absolutely. And I think it's important to acknowledge that HIV treatment is not the best in some of these countries.
Thank you, Jorge, for making that point. It's an important one. And when we think about what receiving services should look like, Bamby, I've heard from you that they're inadequate temporary and longer term shelters and transitional housing programs with resources and supports. So I'd love to hear any recommendations that you all have for what the service landscape is sort of missing, even here in LA County, which is, at least a quarter of our population are immigrants, including many LGBT people. We could certainly be a model for the country about how to best serve LGBTQ immigrants. So any thoughts on that would be great.
I'll jump in really briefly. The number that jumped out to me in your reporting, Kerith, was the age of sort of the majority of the group being 21 to, I don't remember the maximum,
50.
mid-50s. That's the population that I think needs some help, because we have access to youth housing. There are legal aid organizations that focus on children. We have senior services housing. There are organizations that focus on service to seniors. It's everybody else in the middle who comes to our doors here at the LA LGBT Center. And I couldn't agree more with Jorge-Armando. We have a legal issue identified, but maybe that isn't the first problem that needs to be solved. Maybe we need stabilization first around healthcare, safety planning, food needs, medication, and then we can talk about strategy to improve their mental health care or stability or their legal hurdles that they want to take on if they're going to apply for relief. I have a really hard time finding those resources for sort of that age group of people in the middle. And I don't have a solution to my to provide you with my comment, but as we're allocating resources, there's that bell curve, and the resources that I see are focused on the ends. And when people come and say, I'm 30 something years old, I need housing first, and I'm a monolingual Spanish speaker, I don't have a resource to give them, let alone a wait list that's a mile long that everybody else is facing when there are services that they qualify for. So.
Thank you.
Can I chime in just really quickly on that? I mean, I think there needs to be an intentional investment in the livelihood of immigrant communities, right? And again, if just all over the place, right? But here in Los Angeles, if we're able to provide people first with at least those basic things that people need, right? Which is, food and shelter and medicine, then other things can, become, or other things can be addressed, right? But I think there has to be a collaboration between the private and the government sector, right? To really ensure that this investment happens, right? And that there's not just legal services, which that could be for many people a secondary thing, right? But that they are, first we need to address the issue at the root, right? And then, support people the way people need to be supported, so that people are not just, so people don't just survive, but are able to eventually thrive, right? And so it's just a matter of and I know that it's possible because the resources are there, right? Like if we just think about, the Los Angeles County budget, for instance, right? And that's separate from the city, right? Almost $40 billion is the county budget, right? And so if we think about the state budget, right, it's a lot more, right? $300 billion, right? And if we think about the federal budget, right, it's even more. And so there's resources in the government. And if we also think about, philanthropy, there's so much money in philanthropy that they don't even know what to do with the money, but just stash it and continue to create endowments and continue to create all of this. And, people should really think about the humanity of people and really invest in people. and really allocate, the resources to people rather than, stashing it in endowments and all of that stuff.
Bamby, thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists, Tess, Jorge, Bamby, for all of your contributions and all of your service more broadly to the community, particularly the most vulnerable. I do want to let folks know that while we shared some information about LGBT immigrants, there's certainly a lot more that needs to be learned. One way we hope to learn more is through a survey that we're launching at our Unity event on October 24th. It's a survey that we developed in partnership with TransLatin Coalition to learn more about the needs of trans and non-binary people here in LA County. So we're optimistic that we will be able to get that survey out to the community and learn even more building upon what we were able to share today. So please come out and support us. Please sign up for information about our events at the Williams Institute. I'm sure that our adept comms team will post that link in the chat. Please go visit TransLatin Coalition, Equality California, the LA LGBT Center, and support their important work. And thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. All right.
So much. Bye-bye.
Sign up now. All right. Goodbye, everybody.